Good afternoon, and welcome to the 10th Annual Stand Against Racism, hosted by the YWCA's People of Color Executive Council. My name is Leslie Jones. I'm a longtime member of the People of Color Committee and currently a YWCA board member and a host for today's event. I'm honored to welcome you to YWCA's Stand Against Racism, a national campaign to raise awareness of structural racism and build community for people who working for racial justice. To everyone watching today from Seattle, Washington State, and across the U.S., welcome. We have over 600 people who have registered for our first ever virtual Stand Against Racism, and we're glad you're here today. No matter where you are, we want you to take an active role in today's event. Use the chat to connect with others, share where you're from, or what inspired you to be here with us today. And there are YouTube chat moderators ready to answer your questions. Over the next hour, we're going to share some stories about our history and partners in the racial justice movement. Then we're going to hear from our keynote speaker, Ijeoma Oluo, who's here with me at Town Hall, Seattle. Now I'd like to begin today's Stand Against Racism with a few words from Denise Stiffarm, a member of the People of Color Executive Council and YWCA's incoming board chair.
Good afternoon. I'm Denise Stiffarm, incoming board chair at YWCA, member of the People of Color Executive Council, and an enrolled member of the A'anini Nation, the White Clay people. I'd like to acknowledge that we are broadcasting today's event from Seattle, where we stand on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people. As an organization dedicated to ending racial disparities and fighting injustice, YWCA honors its deep connection to this land as a source of life, community, and spirit. We are committed to working in partnership with the Indigenous people of this region who have long protected the land and the Salish Sea and the critical connection of the earth to humanity. Through generations of colonization and oppression, there has been a false erasure of Native identity, history, and land ownership. We offer this acknowledgement as a way to recognize and better understand our collective history so that we can move forward together on the path toward justice and equity. Addressing structural racism and its role in how we grow, work, and live is critical to improving opportunity and well-being across communities. We stand together today in the belief that all people, regardless of race, creed, or ethnicity, deserve to be treated with dignity, respect, compassion, and justice. Thank you for joining YWCA on a mission to stand against racism today and every day.
Denise, thank you for your acknowledgement that this land was stolen from our Indigenous sisters and brothers. We encourage today's viewers to join in the movement to rectify this crime. You can also join YWCA's lineup of events this year that are focused on racial justice. There's the first Bertha Pitts Campbell Equity Awards in June, where we'll be honoring the work of local advocates. Then we have the YWCA's virtual luncheon in the fall, and I'm excited to share some breaking news with you. The 2021 luncheon keynote speaker will be the one and only Stacey Abrams. And we're so excited about having her. And as we all know, she's an amazing political advocate, an attorney, and a bestseller author. And it really will be an event for us to be able to remember. And I'd like you all to please mark your calendars for September the 14th. YWCA works against racism every day, and you can join us now by taking the pledge to stand against racism. It's our tradition to recite the pledge together as an act of collective solidarity. So we want you to join us and recite the pledge at home, work, or wherever you're at. Find a link in to the pledge in the chat, or you can follow the video captions and add your voice to the chorus of community members calling out for change.
I take this pledge.
I take this pledge.
I take this pledge.
I take this pledge.
I take this pledge, fully aware that the struggle to eliminate racism myself and the institution and structures of our society.
I take this pledge to look deeply and continuously within my heart and mind to identify all signs and vestiges of racism.
I pledge to rebuke the use of racist language and behavior towards others.
I pledge to root out such racism in my daily life and in my encounters with persons and with strangers I don't know.
I pledge to expand my consciousness to be more aware and sensitive to my use of overt and subtle expressions of racism and racial stereotypes.
I pledge to educate myself on racial justice issues and share what I learn in my own communities, even if it means challenging my family, my partner, my friends, my coworkers, and those I encounter on a daily basis.
I pledge to actively work to support public policy solutions that prominently, openly, and enthusiastically promote racial equity in all aspects of human affairs.
I pledge to actively support and devote my time to the YWCA, as well as other organizations working to eradicate racism.
YWCA is on a mission to eliminate racism and empower women.
I join YWCA in taking a stand against racism today and every day.
I want to thank the voices in the video for leading us in the pledge, and for our viewers for speaking up against racism. To create change, we need to utilize individual and collective power. It takes courage to use our voice when it's uncomfortable and when our lives are at risk. The global pandemic has exposed the impacts of institutional and structural racism around us. Over the past year, the public has grown more aware of how racial disparities reinforce violence and inequality in the BIPOC communities. Every day, there's another story of Black lives lost to police violence, family separation for Latinx and Black people through the punitive immigration and asylum laws have had a devastating impact. Violence against Asian community has grown nationwide. I'd like to take a moment of silence and acknowledge the disproportionate deaths suffered in our BIPOC communities. In 1970, YWCA National adopted what was called the One Imperative to thrust our collective power towards the elimination of racism wherever it exists by any means necessary. In 2004, when Eliminating Racism, Empowering Women was adopted as the tagline at the YWCA Seattle, King, Snohomish, by 2017, it has become our mission. This is a movement, and we're all a part of it. YWCA is on the same path of growth and learning and change required by all because of the leadership and partnership of groups like the People of Color Executive Council. Our next two speakers are both members of the People of Color Executive Council and model the commitment needed to fight for racial justice every day. Susan and Louis Shell, thank you for all that you do in the fight for equity.
Hello, I'm Susan Mask. I've been a YWCA board member since 2003 and served as board chair in 2006. I'm also co-chair of the People of Color Executive Council, also known as the POCEC. The POCEC is a mix of YWCA board and community members dedicated to working together, raising awareness of institutional racism, and inspiring our community to take action in the fight for equity. They've led the charge for YWCA's racial justice work in community through events and activities like the Stand Against Racism. Our work represents YWCA's unwavering commitment to eliminating racism and empowering women, and builds on the legacy of Black, Indigenous, and POC women who have always led the way for change. YWCA's commitment to racial justice runs deep. Black and Native women were leaders in our movement since it started in the 1800s. The first YWCA for African American women opened in Ohio in 1889. The first student chapter for Native women was founded 1 year later in Oklahoma. And in 1898, 7 chapters were opened at historically Black colleges. In 1919, the Phyllis Wheatley branch YWCA was founded by members of the YWCA's Culture Club who were denied full access to services at the racially segregated YWCA in downtown Seattle. It was named after the poet Phyllis Wheatley, as were many YWCAs across the country at the time. She was born in Africa, enslaved as a child, and the first African American woman to have her writing published in 1776. The Phyllis Wheatley branch was created by and for African American women and located in the heart of the Central District, where redlining and racial segregation had concentrated the city's Black community. It was a shelter, a meeting place, a community hub, responding to the social and emotional needs of African Americans and providing critical services for thousands of people each year. Bertha Pitts Campbell, another African American woman, civil rights advocate, and co-founder of Delta Sigma Theta, was the chair of the Phyllis Wheatley branch for 4 years and represented the branch at YWCA board meetings. Pitts Campbell fought for her rights and became the first Black woman to vote on a YWCA board nationwide in 1936. Today, we celebrate BIPOC women who have helped YWCA build an inclusive organization and pursued racial equity in our movement. For 127 years, YWCA has been committed to breaking down barriers in the most critical areas of people's lives by providing services for housing, economic advancement, health, and safety. Today, we carry the work of our elders forward as we strive to create intersectional justice for women who are experiencing systemic and institutional racism on multiple levels. On behalf of the POCEC, thank you for joining us today for the 10th anniversary of the Stand Against Racism. Since our first event in 2011, we've heard from an array of speakers and covered a variety of topics, such as anti-racist housing solutions, income inequality for women of color, the school-to-prison pipeline, racial health inequities, and restorative justice. We're deeply grateful for all of the people in the past and present who've helped build this into a free, accessible, and educational event that draws hundreds of attendees each year who have helped celebrate our unwavering stance against racism through social justice and education work. Together, we can build systems that truly value, uplift, and serve BIPOC women in King and Snohomish counties. But the fight against injustice requires all of us to act, and the time to act is here and now. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope to see you again next year.
Thank you, Leslie and Susan. There's an elephant in the room. And by room, I mean the United States of America, with its citizens' discomfort about talking about race, which results in more comfort in tolerating racism. Every day it feels as though our country is imploding, and there are still people who would rather tolerate racism than gather enough courage to speak out as anti-racists. It's way past time for open, honest conversations about where America has been with regard to its racist history, and where America is, and where America plans to go from here. The Stand Against Racism event is designed to be one tool for us to get there. And every once in a while, a book comes along that says exactly what I believe needs to be said, a book that I don't put down until I complete it. One such book is the #1 New York Times bestseller, So You Want to Talk About Race, by Ijeoma Oluo. Ijeoma lives and writes and speaks right here in Seattle. And because she is an author and an internet yeller, she speaks to the world. I could spend my time telling you how Ijeoma has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Seattle Times, among other big-name publications, or how she's on the 2021 Time 100 list and has twice been named to the Root 100. I could emphasize how she's received the 2018 Feminist Humanist Award and the Harvard Humanist of the Year Award in 2020. But I want to spend my time talking about how she writes with a sister girl, no nonsense, cut to the chase and avoid the fluff approach. Yes, indeed, talking about race and racism is awkward and difficult. Newsflash. It's not the most fun thing for people of color to talk about either. We'd rather be changing the world in other ways, but our survival is at stake. One reviewer wrote about So You Want to Talk About Race that he was not thrilled to be categorized as a white supremacist simply because he is white. But he chose to hang in there with his discomfort, his confusion and eyebrow raises and slack-jawed moments. Then he acknowledged that his world feels bigger after reading Ijeoma's book. He said his perspective has changed because he had not understood or even recognized his own racism or white privilege. So for all who claim to be afraid to talk about race and racism and how it feels like you're walking on eggshells when you're required to do so, Ijeoma helps you out with that. I love that she calls out the questions that I hear in my anti-racism work with clients all the time, and she answers those questions with grace and grit. Questions like, is it really about race? I think it's about class. Ijeoma challenges those who are called white to question the assumptions that white achievement occurs on a level playing field. She's very clear that while the people called white are not individually responsible for racist systems or the circumstances under which they have skin color privilege, they are responsible for how they respond to racist systems and behaviors. The book, Ijeoma, is when you explain that when people of color talk about systemic racism, we are opening up all of our pain and fear and anger, and we are demanding that she gives you a to-do list. So as a practitioner in anti-racism consulting and training, I happily recommend that my clients read anything Ijeoma Oluo writes, including her newest tell-all book, Mediocre, The Dangerous Legacy of White Male America. In it, she helps us explore the question, what happens to a country that tells generation after generation of white men that they deserve all the power? It's a page turner. So, as we say in the Black church, speak, Ijeoma, speak.
Thank you. That was such a wonderful introduction. It just fills me up. It's so wonderful to hear my work making such an impact on people. One thing when I'm writing that I always try to think of is, does this benefit Black women? There's always another Black woman in the room, whether real or fictional, when I'm writing. And everything I put out there with regards to race and gender, I'm thinking, does this make her life easier? Does this help her in some way? Even if she's not the intended audience for the work, that is always something on my mind. And so hearing from Black women that my work helps is the highest compliment that I can imagine. I started writing about race because I did not want to live in a society that didn't see me anymore. I started writing about race from a place of desperation. I was working in tech, like many people in the Seattle area are. I was often the only Black person in the room. I was often one of very few women in the room. And what I realized after a lifetime of living in this supposedly politically liberal space was that it was not a space that saw me as a Black woman. It was not a space that valued me. It was not a space that would fight for me. I started writing because I needed to know that I wasn't alone. I started writing because I needed us to start talking about race and racism and the ways in which it existed in all of our neighborhoods, not just in the ways that make headlines. I needed to know that the community I had grown up in cared about me, cared about my brothers, cared about my children. I needed to know that we could move forward to have a society where we all counted. So I was trying to find a different way to get people to understand that we needed to engage in these issues. And my writing career really started organically. It started with Facebook posts and this little food blog I had that I turned into a blog about race. And I would just write what I was feeling. And I was hoping that if the people I knew, the people I worked with, my neighbors, saw this and saw how much these issues were impacting me, they could look around and see that they were likely impacting others and that there was something that we needed to do. From there, my writing career started. My first book, So You Want to Talk About Race, was written out of a place of frustration, recognizing the need that we had to get past basic arguments, to get past debates over verbiage, and move towards conversation that led to action. It was a book that I hope people would take with them to help solve real problems of racial inequities in their workplaces, their churches, their schools, and their families. What I have found is that people are talking about race. They're talking about it all of the time. And this past year, we have seen that we could talk about it even more. After the horrific murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many other Black people lost to the violence of our systems, we saw people take to streets en masse to protest for Black lives. We saw book sales of books like mine and many others who write on issues of racism in America skyrocket. I honestly didn't know that so many people could buy my book. What had seemed like a successful book to me in the past was nothing compared to what I saw this past year. We saw corporate statements from just about every company on issues of race. Suddenly, everyone had something to say. Everyone believed that Black lives matter. Everyone believed that something should be done. But what has been done? What has your increased awareness brought? What can you hold in your hand that this talk has brought you? I always try to remind people, this isn't group therapy. We aren't having these discussions so that we can have a good cry, bare our soul, and then go home and continue like normal. Yes, it is absolutely important to be heard. It is vital that we counteract the violent gaslighting of this country that tells populations of color that the racism that we experience every day does not exist. It is true. We must be able to name what is happening to us. But it is also true that these conversations come at extreme risk and cost. And it is true that we cannot heal from something that is still happening. I and so many others write and speak on issues of race and racism because we need action. These systems are killing us. They are killing us quickly and violently, like we saw with George Floyd, and Breonna Taylor, and so many others. Or is killing us slowly from our inability to find work, to get equal education, to get adequate medical care, from our inability to feel safe in our homes and our neighborhoods. We have to talk about race. We have to talk in order to be able to understand what we face, in order to see other people's truths, in order to find areas for action, and in order to remain motivated and accountable to each other. But often, this is not why many people, especially white people, decide to have conversations on race. And so, for those who feel like their conversation has been enough, let me be clear. Learning about something isn't the same as doing something. Speaking about something isn't the same as doing something. Feeling sad doesn't mean you've done something. Feeling angry doesn't mean you've done something. And feeling uncomfortable doesn't mean you have either. Our feelings about systems of race only matter in how they motivate us to act. Our knowledge only matters in how it informs our action. This summer, I said that a lot of what we are seeing in this rise in need for information about race and racism is like leaving your home and recognizing that every other house on your street is on fire. And as people are desperately trying to save homes and lives, saying to yourself, I should go back inside and learn more about how fire works. The truth is in that moment, what you need to be doing is asking, what can I do? Where can I be of service? How can I help put out this fire? The people who have read the books, the people who are experts in putting out fires, will be able to direct you into a space of action. And later, when the fires are out, you can learn more about how they start so that you can make sure they don't happen again. We must recognize that we are in an emergency, and we have been for over 400 years. This last year has been some of the hardest times that many of us have seen in our lifetime. And for those of you who are recognizing how difficult things have been, I want those of racial privilege in the audience to recognize that the reality that you are suffering in, the reality that you have feared, has been the reality for many populations of color for multiple generations. The reality of job insecurity is one that we have always known, when even having a Black-sounding name makes you less likely to get a job interview, when having an accent often disqualifies you from jobs in the eyes of employers. A world of medical incompetence and shortage, where you do not have access to the care you need, where medical workers always seem too busy to help you. That is a world we have always known. When you feel failed by our systems, when you feel failed by our government, recognize that there are many of us who have never had the luxury of being served by our systems. If that feels untenable, that's because it is. If you feel like you can't suffer this forever, that is because none of us were meant to. And even now, in these times, in this time of crisis when we should be banding together, we find that systemic racism has magnified this crisis for communities of color even further. Medical racism is putting us at increased risk of death. Educational racism is ensuring that our children are even more isolated in schools than ever before and more undereducated than ever before. Employment discrimination means that we will be more likely to be laid off of jobs and less likely to be able to find well-paying jobs when they return. There is a rise in xenophobia and violent hatred against Asian Americans. Police violence did not take a single breath during this crisis. And we have found in recent months doubled down efforts to politically disenfranchise Black and brown communities. And yet, in these very hard times, there are opportunities. Everything that we know has been called into question this last year. All of the failures of our systems has been laid bare in a way that nobody can deny. It is important to recognize that right now we have to build something new. We are finding new ways to educate our young people, new ways to work, new ways to communicate with each other, new ways to be in community, new ways to be politically engaged. Think of how much change has happened this past year. Those of you who work in racial equity will likely have had a conversation with whatever structure it is you are trying to change. And you have been told in the past that what you ask for is too much. It is too big. It is impossible. That big change takes time, that it must be incremental. I'm sure that these phrases sound familiar. But look at how differently we move through the world today than we did a year ago. Imperfect as it is, look at how much we have changed these gigantic systems. And so what that proves is what we were missing was not a way, it was the will. There have never been good excuses for not making change. And now, whatever pretense there was to any have been stripped away by the rapid change that we have been able to accomplish. While we are rebuilding our systems, while we are reimagining them, radical anti-racism must be at the center of our work. There is no back to go to. What we had before was too weak, too broken, and far too cruel. It does not exist for us. It never did. The only way forward, and there can be in the future, is with us. There is no future, no rebirth without racial justice. Now is the time to engage with the systems around you. Now is the time to make yourself aware of how our systems are impacting your lives individually and the lives of your community members. It is important to let go of the idea that our systems work the same way for everyone, and recognize that if there's one thing this past year has shown us, it is that there are people who will be deeply harmed every time there is a failure to be had in our systems. Understand how these systems work and find out how you relate to them. We all have power in our systems. We do not have equal power. We do not have it all in the same places. But we have power. And we must learn to engage that power now. Now, while we have the opportunity to build something new. Find your power in your school board, in your PTA. Find it in your workplace, in your meetings. Find it with your vote. Find it in your church, in your community. Find it with your dollars. You find areas of action by listening. If you say you do not know what to do, it is because you have not been listening to the people who have been saying what to do. We, as communities of color, do not suffer in silence. We have been stating what needs to change for many, many years. You need to listen to what is being said. You need to listen to what has been said. You must quantify the racial environments to populations of color. I do this work because systemic racism is impacting the lives of populations of color in measurable ways. It is impacting the level of education our children receive, their chances of graduating. It is impacting the rate of medical care we receive, whether we survive childbirth, whether we survive heart attacks or cancer. It is impacting our ability to become employed, our ability to get promoted, our ability to work in a safe and healthy environment. It is impacting whether or not we are heard politically, whether our communities have a robust infrastructure, whether we have the resources we need to keep our communities safe. That is why I do this work. Because every day I am confronted with the reality of how these systems are crushing and killing us. It is measurable. This means that the racism in your church is measurable. The racism in your colleges and universities is measurable. The racism in your workplace is measurable. The racism in your local government is measurable. And because it is measurable, we have a way to hold people accountable. Measure what is happening, by listening to what has been said, by looking at all of the information, and then demand change that brings measurable results. We got a lot of vague promises from organizations this past year. A lot of oaths were sworn that were measurable in no way. What we need are commitments. Commitments to reduce the harm done by systemic racism. Commitments to aid in the healing of our communities. Commitments to partner with communities of color to build a better and bolder future. Now is a time for radical imagination. A lot of the time that people tell me that there is nothing to be done, it makes me laugh sadly because we have tried so little. And I don't mean that we haven't tried hard. What I mean is there are very few things we have tried. For far too long, the narrative around race is the only way in which we rid ourselves of racism is by reaching the hearts and minds of every individual racist in this country and convincing them to love us, to see our humanity. There is nothing else to be done. Our systems are set in stone. They work the way they work. And occasionally there are a few bad people with hate in their hearts operating in these systems who make it difficult for others. But we could change the hearts and minds of every white person in this country, and our systems would still be crushing populations of color. The truth is we must do our work in our systems, and we must be willing to try something we've never tried before. We can build a new future together, and we must. We must recognize that old systems will not serve us, that the status quo cannot hold. We must be willing to try what we have been afraid to try. We must recognize that these systems have been built by people no greater than us. And therefore, we have everything within us to build something better. We must be willing to come out of this fundamentally changed. We must be willing to recognize that we can't actually see what liberation will look like. We must be willing to step into the unknown and know that no matter what, it will be better than this. We must decide that we are worth the risk. One thing I say to myself and to other people of color in this work is you are more important than white supremacy. I am more important than white supremacy. I am more important than these systems. I am more important than the status quo. And to every person of color watching this, so are you. You are worth the risk. So am I. Every person sacrificed to this system is one too many. We must grieve and rage at it and say no more. And every opportunity that we have to make change is worth it. Every victory that enables a person of color in this country not only to survive but to thrive is a victory worth celebrating, and yet it will never be enough until these systems have been brought down and replaced with ones that are just, ones that value not only who we are, but who we can be. I know that we can do this together, and we have to. We have to imagine a new future, and we all have to be in that future. That is what I am working for, and I hope that you will join me. I hope that the next time we gather to talk, we can discuss all of the progress we have made. We can start to see the path towards liberation that we are on. It will be beautiful, and I hope to see you there. Thank you.
Ijeoma, you're incredible. Thank you so much for your words of encouragement and giving us a way of thinking about how we can all come together as a community to make the kind of change that we need to have in all of our lives. And I am just struck by your brilliance and your leadership, and just want to thank you for that, because the stand is for all of us to come together and say to ourselves and to our community that we are going to stand together against racism. And you have given us some steps to take a look at how we can move forward. And it's not just a pledge, but it's really taken the kind of risk to envision the future that we all want to live in for ourselves and for our children. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
I now want to welcome our final speaker. We are going to hear from Renee Cogdell-Lewis, who was recently elected as the co-chair of the People of Color Executive Council.
Hi, I'm Renee Cogdell-Lewis. I'm a member of the POCEC and joined YWCA's Board of Directors in 2020. I'm also honored to share that starting next month, I'll be serving alongside Susan Mask as POCEC co-chair. I was involved with YWCA of Metropolitan Chicago growing up, so when I moved to Seattle, I was glad to connect with YWCA and a community of people dedicated to eliminating racism and empowering women. Then, we were hit by COVID-19 and a year of cascading trauma and stress that has worsened existing racial disparities in health, employment, housing, and safety, threatened to push women and BIPOC communities further from equity and widen the opportunity gap. Throughout this challenging year, I've been inspired to take action in the areas that matter most to me, like joining YWCA's Public Policy Committee to help advocate for legislative change on core issues that impact the needs of marginalized communities. YWCA has been at the forefront of the biggest issues of the day for over 127 years, from affordable housing to pay equity to voting rights and violence prevention. YWCA carries on this long tradition of social action and advocacy to advance our mission. And you are a crucial part of this work. Now that you've taken a stand against racism, I want you to think about your next step. What is one thing you can do to commit yourself to the work of racial equity? It's time for all of us to step up to our roles in dismantling systemic racism, leading conversations, and doing our part to drive long-term solutions that get at the roots of inequity. If you're not sure where to start, visit YWCA's website for a list of resources from the 2021 Stand Against Racism. You can also download the Stand Against Racism pledge and put it somewhere you can see it every day. And you're not alone. The Stand Against Racism is also about building community, including all of the people watching this right now. We must work together in the fight for justice because the future deserves all of us. Thank you for joining YWCA to against racism today, tomorrow, and every day.
YWCA is on a mission to stand against racism today and every day, and we invite you to join us. As I mentioned earlier, the Bertha Pitts Campbell Equity Awards will be held on June the 10th, and the 2021 Inspired Luncheon with Stacey Abrams is on September the 14th. Now, on behalf of the YWCA King, Snohomish County, and the People of Color Executive Council, we want to thank you for joining us today. Keep standing against racism every day, and we hope to see you again next year. Thank you.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring. Ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let all rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the roaring sea. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring with the harmonies of liberty. lemonade.